and we're an organisation that looks after housing and employment and links to the government. So I'm in charge of chairing the session today and also housekeeping. So housekeeping, I was overtaken then by one of my housekeeping points. Recording is happening. That's standard for cash webinars. So obviously you're free as participants to keep your cameras off and to use the Q&A function to interact with us. But we're recording it so that we can share the webinar more broadly, and that will go in about 24 hours. That will go onto YouTube, and Cash will share that with you as registrants from this webinar. So look out for that. Feel free to share that, to post it once it's ready. But for obvious reasons, that allows us to capture what we say today and share that more widely. So recordings on. You should also see as a participant a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. That's the best way to communicate with the moderators for the webinar today and enable me to see questions that are coming through or comments as you see fit. So if you've got anything that you want to share or say or ask, please use that Q&A box, and I will, as chair, keep an eye on that, and we'll get through as many comments or questions as we can for the panelists. And if there's anything we really can't cover, I'll endeavour to pick up those points with the team at Cash after the webinar and come back to individual participants. So that's pretty straightforward on housekeeping. There isn't a lot more to it than that. But welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for finding the time to find out about this primer piece of research. Here at Communities That Work, we've been involved really just chairing the conversations and the project team around the foundation stages of this research into this webinar launch today. And it's been a real pleasure to do that. As the national body on housing and employment, we have a very natural interest in this topic area. And it came about for Communities That Work because one of our member organisations, Unity Housing, were looking for a research base and wanted to look from an academic research perspective into work that they are undertaking around enterprise and employment. So that's natural areas of interest for us. We need information from our members to work with and feed into government, and that's our bread and butter. That's what we do day in, day out, working with the government of the day to talk about the role of social housing in employment. So this primary research sat really comfortably with that, and we've learnt as we've gone along with the research team here and with Unity about the experiences, the opportunities, the challenges, and the realities of delivering a good employment and enterprise service. This research is really timely, and even on this week, we've picked a lucky week really for this webinar launch. There's an awful lot going on now. Government is it's finding its feet. It's moving from manifesto pledges to policy realisation across government departments, and not least with the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions. So this week, a new white paper has come out called Get Britain Working. It's a reasonably comprehensive white paper which states the DWP and the government's position on how they see employment and skills support going forwards. It doesn't detail who's going to do what, and it doesn't detail commissioning pipelines. It's not at that level, but it does describe key activities and key goals that they want to achieve in government. And they are quite stretching and quite ambitious, as we expected, as we saw in the Labour Party's manifesto as they were campaigning to win the election. So I won't go into huge details on the white paper, and all of our members at Communities at Work will get a briefing on the white paper. But just to set the scene a little bit, it's describing a target of an 80% employment rate in the UK, which will mean an extra 1.5 to 2.5 million people in work than there are today. And that largely the people who will be supported into work are here now. So although that's not a total figure, the vast majority of that number are people who are here now, who are for very many complex reasons not in work and described as economically inactive in terms of the national data terminology. So the government is turning its sights to supporting people who may have been out of work for a long time, or young people who haven't entered work and are stuttering at the start of a career, to get them the support they need and mainstream the experience of work for many more people. So that is far reaching, and is going to involve a lot of sectors and a lot of partnerships to achieve it. That's not something the government can do on its own, even if budgets were very generous or limitless, which they're not at the moment. So the government will be looking for partnerships. And we think, whilst there are many challenges at the moment in the workforce and in the labour market, there are going to be some growing opportunities for the social housing sector and other partners to deliver new and different employment support. So watch this space for white paper information briefings and further announcements. There are a couple of things in addition to the 80% employment rate, which I think are just worth mentioning at the outset here, and which we'll hear more about in terms of how Unity have responded to supporting tenants and residents into work. Things that we might all see starting to change on our high streets and neighbourhoods is Job Centre Plus is going to look and feel different. It's going to be a careers service as well. So at the moment, the government estimates that only 1/3 of people who ever need a job or job advice ever walk into Job Centre Plus. They're looking to change that. In addition, so Job Centre Plus may change its style, its look, the nature of the advice you can get in there, and who walks in. That plays into some work we're doing at the moment. We're piloting and testing 10 sites called Jobs Plus, which is housing-led employment support centres on high streets, in libraries, in community centres. They are aiming to reach people who are further from the labour market, economically inactive, may have been unemployed, or away from the labour market for very many reasons for very many years, but for whom actually, with the right support at the right time, they can and do and will enter work. So we're looking at that and how that might complement the reforming job centres. There's going to be guarantees for young people to have a job or training or an apprenticeship as they leave school or college. And this government is not going to be without the carrot and stick approach, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out. So there is still going to be a combination of incentives and support and consequences and sanctions for not working along with the government. So it'd be really interesting to see how this new Labour government, for the first time in 14, 15 years, applies its principles to us, to the general population, to people seeking work, to people who need support into work. So there is a lot going on. The white paper, and that's changed from the beginning of when we started this research to today. So the context is kind of shifting and changing, but there is going to be new and different opportunities for us. So without further ado, on that note of sort of changing tides and changing sands, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gareth Young from CASH and the University of Sheffield. So huge thanks to, I have to say, huge thanks to Gareth for really taking on this project. And producing a primer piece of research today that is launching this morning, which is excellent and gives a fresh pair of academic eyes on an existing piece of work, which we felt quite familiar with, but actually we're looking at with fresh eyes again this morning. Huge thanks also to Professor Ken Gibb, who gave the foreword to this research, which has been sent to all registrants today. The team at CASH who've been supporting Gareth and Ken, Glenn, who's on screen in the background helping to set up this webinar, and all the team at Unity, from Cedric, who's here today, to Adrian, to Kelly, to Barry, who've helped to make this research happen. So huge thanks there go to everyone who's been involved in this research and who's given a lot of time to making this right. And after Gareth, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dean McGlynn from HACT and Cedric from Unity about their perspectives on this research. But without further ado, I'll share my screen so that Gareth can go through a brief set of slides and describe the research that we're presenting today and launching today. So Gareth, welcome. Thank you very
Lynsey.
much for leading this research. And whenever you're ready, I'll move through the slides. So please just let me know.
Perfect. No, thank you for that introduction, Lynsey, and thank you for everyone who's joined us today. That's great. The inevitable tech issues and woes started, so I can't share my screen and see my notes. Well, Lynsey's kindly doing that for me, and we're going to go back to a sort of 2020 throwback of next slide, please. But yeah, welcome everyone. It's been great to have the opportunity to do this piece of primary research, and we're sort of calling it a piece of primary research because it isn't an in-depth evaluation of the services that Unity are providing, but it is an opportunity to have, as Lynsey said, this refreshed conversation within this context around these issues that we know are intrinsically linked between housing and employment, and also to get to help sort of shape some further research, both more broadly nationally, but also for Unity. So yeah, next slide, please, Lynsey, if
Okay.
that's all right.
Oh, I say that's all right. It doesn't like that. The famous last words. Here we go. There you go.
There
Sorry.
we go. No, you're absolutely fine. So everyone on this call will probably already know this, and Lynsey's done a good job of covering it. But just to sort of set the scene in terms of the context. So we know that there's strong evidence that housing providers play a key and critical role in all aspects of tenants' lives, not just their housing. Although that is the core service. We also know that housing associations are the second biggest funder of employment support behind DWP. So they are kind of key and really invested into this space. But housing associations and the kind of role of social housing has changed over time. There's increased regulation and constrained pressures on these organisations to do a lot of things, improve a lot of things. And so despite announcements through sort of like continued funding through the affordable housing programme, we know that it's at a critical point for housing associations, and it's either an opportunity or risk. We know people will be withdrawing from providing these services to make sure that other elements of their business sort of stand up. So that's kind of the first point. I think the second point, again, as we all know and we talk about a lot, funding is either reduced or stagnant. So we've lost kind of European social funding, which has to some degree been replaced by the Shared Prosperity Fund. But we know from conversations in this work that's not kind of fully covering everything that the ESF did previously. Cedric will introduce Unity a little bit more, but just to say that Unity are both housing and enterprise, so they've got employment support within the work that they do, but also business units and business support as well, which is a huge part of their business. But nationally funding, so through the new enterprise allowance, for example, that was disbanded in 2022. So there's no sort of mainstream funding for business support. We know that we're in a cost of living crisis. People are, kind of forever feeling the pinch. We've got patchy labour markets and employment support across the country. So we know we've got nationally delivered programmes, but on a local level, things are happening in very different ways. And I was chatting to someone who does a lot of work in a city in the West Midlands, I think it was, she was saying, and there was sort of, I think something like 72 different organisations involved in employment support in just that space. So from an individual trying to navigate where they can go is hard, but also for organisations to navigate and know who else is operating in their space. And I've mentioned increased pressures on the housing association sector. Just one final point before we move on to the next slide. Lynsey covered this. So when we started the project, we hadn't got the Labour government in place. We now have, and housing and employment are two kind of key pillars, as well as national renewal. And just a final point I've not put on the slide that happened during the course of this research was the summer riots, which we know were motivated by race and racism. And the reason I mention that is that I know, and I've linked this in the report, is that the Housing Diversity Network have covered a lot of this work, but housing associations have a role around community cohesion as well, and have been heavily involved in kind of some of the aftermath of this. And some of the work they produced highlights that scarcity of resources such as housing and jobs can be a reason for conflict like this. So that was just to set the scene. Next slide, please, Lynsey.
Okay.
And I'll do the same.
There we go.
So this is very much a quick presentation. So I'm just going to do a snapshot of sort of three key findings. We can hopefully kind of get into more detail in the Q&A, and then there is the report there as well for people to read after this. But I just wanted to kind of touch on 3 points that I thought were kind of particularly striking. So I should also caveat, we did about 35 interviews for this project. So that included what we've called key informants. That's on a national scale across housing and employment. On a local level, sort of centred around the operational sort of geography of Unity. So in kind of Leeds and West Yorkshire. And we have spoken to Unity staff, and I've spoken to tenants, both of Unity's business and housing, as well as people in the community who are engaging with their support services, because Unity work beyond just their tenants as well. So that's kind of the findings come from those conversations. And what really struck me was, and this idea of back to basics, person-centered approaches and support is kind of really seen as key and valuable. The points that I'm making are not groundbreaking, and that's not to be disparaging of the work. That is mirroring kind of language used in the Better Social Housing Review and other evidence that's gone before it. It's kind of reaffirming things that we know and things that we know can work quite well, and also things that can be done at this point in time. We're kind of really supportive of the talk of ongoing long-term strategies, but there are people right now who are desperately trying to seek support and kind of move through their lives, and they need that help right now. So it was really striking, just these kind of informal conversations, the power that they can hold for people. And this is particularly for people who aren't necessarily ready to engage with formal employment or business support. They just really need their confidence to be built back up, and they need that feeling of empowerment and rapport and trust. So the quote that I've put there on the left hand side was a story of someone who found herself out of work sort of later in her career. So she'd done a job for 20 or so years. The situation around her loss of jobs was quite traumatic as well. I think it was done in a not particularly nice way. So that also impacted on her confidence. But it was just that feeling of lack of empowerment. Like she was saying, you just feel rubbish about yourself. You just don't feel like you've got a purpose, and that will have that knock-on impact of putting yourself out there. I think from speaking to the tenants and anyone engaging with the services, plus all those kind of working in West Yorkshire who've also got stories to tell about the support that they offer, it was just striking how different and varied all of the stories were. So when we talk about economically inactive or social housing tenants and all of these kind of broad categorizations, we can start to refer to them as kind of homogenous groups, but actually it's far more nuanced and complex as a picture. So just a real sort of quick snapshot is that I spoke to people who were young and unemployed. And I know, Lynsey, you were talking that a lot of the kind of white paper is focusing on younger people, which is great. But I spoke to young people who sort of didn't know where to start, or they'd be going to interviews and getting the knockbacks, and that can kind of put them off kind of continuing to do that. As I say, people who've been out in work for quite a long time and have lost work, or also spoke to people who are in quite precarious work, 0-hour contracts, things that can kind of come and go, sort of bits of self-employment, that sort of thing, who might not be used to engaging with job applications or services in a digital way before they would apply for things that they would say they'd seen in the paper. They would turn up for an interview in person and talk about why they're right for the job. And actually all of this was incredibly overwhelming for people. A lot of people don't have access to, to the internet or to phones and things like that. So there was quite a lot of issues there. So I need to rattle on because I'm talking too much.
That's fine.
But the other point here as well, which was talking about hard to reach communities, and I know that gets talked about quite a lot, and that was quite frustrating, I think, for some of the people that I was talking to in the interviews here, is actually we should be reframing hard to reach as how to reach, particularly from a housing association perspective. We know who the people are that we're kind of letting out properties to and sort of kind of signing these agreements. People are there. It's just sometimes people are slightly further away from the mainstream services. What I found really striking with Unity and work that I've done in the past with housing associations is that it feels like housing employees, housing staff, people on the front line always do tend to go over and above the work that they do, and they really do care about their tenants. And that really came through here as well, where it's sort of described as more than a job.
Okay.
One of the things that was kind of, I guess, a solution to kind of this problem of hard to reach was kind of tenancy health checks, which were mentioned. So the staff were talking about how they do tenancy health checks across the piece. This can help to engage with tenants more regularly or re-engage with tenants who they haven't spoken to before. And on the flip side, tenants have found that really helpful because it's an opportunity for them to talk about whatever situation they're in and can be signposted to other services. So one example was someone who is a single mum. She's a couple of years away from her universal credit benefits ending. So she's not in a position where she needs work right now. She tried to get support for changing a career and training with the Job Centre Plus. He said, there's nothing we can really offer you at the moment, feeling really despondent about that. Through one of these health checks with Unity staff, she relayed that story, and it was at that point they said, well, you do realise that we've got employment support here for you. We can have these conversations. She is now on a funded training course to retrain, and that didn't happen immediately, but she could have those conversations about what her ambitions are, what she's wanting to do. And Unity had regular conversations. They checked in with her fairly frequently. I think she was saying weekly calls at the start. She felt like the only person they deal with, because she had that level of contact, wasn't linked to any sort of conditional support. It was just there to go, how are you? We're still working to try and find you solutions to your problems. So yeah, I will move on to the next slide, if that's all right.
Okay.
So again, we know that this government is focused on national renewal, inclusive growth, and the white paper this week has outlined that sort of their number one mission is to grow the economy. Within the white paper, it does say that in order to achieve the targets for the employment and economy, it requires a full UK-involved government, public sector, third sector, and business effort. And I think that was just interesting for this and conversations that have gone before about actually this needs to be an ecosystem of organisations supporting, of which housing associations, certainly place-based housing associations, as Unity are and as many are over the country, where they are embedded within the community. I think there's a really critical role that they can play and that Unity are playing in that kind of idea of inclusive growth. As one of the quotes says, that they're ideally placed because they have that direct line into communities. We've talked about that before. They're there, they're embedded, they're building up their trust, they're working with their tenants across various different services, but they also have that ability to reach kind of policy and practice at a strategic level through sort of links with government, links with local authorities or combined authorities, as well as kind of active membership organisations such as Communities that Work, that do have seats at these different tables, and they can share these stories about, this is what we do locally, these are the challenges that we're facing on the ground. So they have got a really kind of key role to play kind of both ways, as it were. It was talked about that housing associations have access, reach, and patience. I think the patience point is key, as well as the fact that housing associations are often there for the long haul, their long-termism. They're not linked to the political cycles or the funding cycles that a lot of other policies can be. They'll be embedded with that long-term future approach and future proofing. And I think the patience is really key as well with the work and delivery. You know, people that we're talking about here, and I was referring to their stories in the last slide, are people that might be sort of further away from ready to engage with formal support. They might be having lots of different knockbacks. It's actually just that hand holding and just being there to support is really key. On the second point, I thought was really striking. This came from a business tenant, but has been spoken across the piece, is actually work like Unity, when they're providing the business support, the employment support, these units and all of that sort of thing, is not replicating the work that's happening on a national scale and the work that's happening at the Job Centre Plus. A lot of the work happening nationally might be kind of rolled out in a fairly standard sort of way. That's not a criticism of it. That's just kind of the way it operates, especially when it's on such a scale. But what happens when you've got an organisation like Unity? Cedric will talk more about them, but Unity is a Black-led housing association. It works with and recognises its community needs, what the community wants, the community challenges. And it was said to me that through having that was the selling point for businesses approaching Unity to be part of that. It kind of really recognises not everybody starts from the same point, and that there's different levels of support needed. And that's that kind of equity point. Actually, it's bringing everyone up as well, and that's kind of a really key role that these kind of place-based organisations can play. A couple of phrases that were mentioned that I thought was really good or kind of really striking again, is the idea of a chance to fail, and people felt that Unity give them a chance they wouldn't have had to either try setting up their own business or going for a career switch or trying something new or some training, because these people describe themselves as, we're not the sort of people that have that sort of safety net behind usually to just take those risks. And what we've titled the report and this presentation is They Want You to Win. And it felt like engagement with the services was there for you, really trying to better yourself, recognizing that you as an individual do have ambition and you can move forward. So next slide, please, Lynsey. Very quick final kind of point is amongst all of this, and the key and critical role that housing associations have, is it was never described necessarily as that this should be mandatory for housing associations. It needs to be recognised that housing associations, front and central, have to provide decent, secure, safe housing for people. And they are governed, bound by boards and the regulator, and have all of these other external pressures on there. There will be areas across the country that don't have the presence of a housing association. So, kind of suggesting that housing associations are the only model forward isn't going to work in every area. And also, there are areas where, it was described to me that employment support is happening really well by other providers. That doesn't mean that housing associations shouldn't be involved. They are a key anchor institution in a lot of places. As we've talked about, they have a lot of points of contact, a lot of leverage and ways that they can support. So, they have a role to play, but I think we can't put all of the expectation on the sector to be delivering all of this. It has to be done as a collective. Next slide, please. So just some very concluding thoughts. I've got some recommendations in the report, which I've not drawn on as much here. But just to say that I think, housing associations do need to be part of this conversation to help drive forward the long-term strategies and inform policy, as I said, about the challenges that they're facing on the ground and some of the tensions sort of between regulation and social mission, and the way that services can work well. I think that the white paper, the recognition that the current system is possibly serving challenges of the past, and that we need to think about how, what things look like now, and talking about across a systems wide approach is really encouraging. That health needs to be involved, mental health needs to be considered, housing, employment. I think delivery of these sort of mechanisms through combined authority seems sensible. That's kind of what's come out of some of the conversations that I've had. Of course, where there aren't kind of male authorities, and it's going to rely on a group of local authorities to sort of take some of these approaches forward, I think that needs careful consideration to ensure that there's not this continued kind of postcode lottery. But yeah, just to say that I think people need to be at the heart of services, and that services need to be connected to each other. And really key actually is that we have spaces like this, and that we can share learning. As I say, the reports and evidence that's gone before, things that I've mentioned here, showed really good practice. If we could steal ideas, that's me stealing an idea from a Place Shapers conference last week, there's lots that can be learned if we could have a space where we could share more of these stories. None of this work can be achieved alone. So I sort of finish on a bit of a question that we might cover, is that how do we organise this across different areas with different governance structures? So that's a very rapid, probably a bit longer than I should have done, rattle through of some of the work. So
yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks, Gareth. And I know that we've got your contact details at the end here. So thank you right back for giving a really good sort of personal and bringing out the people stories from the research. Of course, the paper is now freely available on Cash's website. It's a great read, and it's got strong recommendations within it. But I really like the fact that you're talking about actually how this affects people and their lives, because that's what we're all in the business of trying to do, right? So I think we can promise, if you're happy, Gareth, that these slides are shared with the participants today, along with the recording. Is that okay?
Absolutely. And, I'd love to hear from people if you've got any thoughts or stories to tell or anything. So please do get in touch.
Fantastic. So, and obviously your contact is there on the slides. So
Yeah,
thank you very much indeed. That was perfect. I'm going to
thank
stop
you.
sharing now. And I'm going to invite Dean McGlynn from HACT to give some reflections on what Dean's perspective is as communities network lead at HACT, is all over this kind of area of work, how to reach out and work well in communities. HACT have a long track record in this, and we really appreciate you coming along today, Dean. So over to you. The floor is yours for any thoughts and reviews of the research as you've read it this morning. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Lynsey. Brief introduction to HACT for those that aren't aware on the call. I'm sure there aren't many, but HACT is the Housing Association Charitable Trust. Been around since the early 1960s, doing lots of work to sort of set up housing associations, but in our sort of modern iteration, we do a lot of work around social value and community investment and things like health and housing. So within that, we offer tools and insights into measuring social value. So that being, how do we measure the outcomes and interventions in people's lives that allow them to live well and in good, decent communities and increase their quality of life. And those sort of tangible impacts. So trying to make almost the intangible tangible through our social value work. And we have our bank, 88 different outcomes, trying to give the sort of financial metric around social value, the well-being value, and any sort of health and sort of public savings that social value work may result in. I guess what we try and do through our work at HACT is trying to make sure that it's very much a people-centered approach, very much based on outcomes and how they impact people's lives directly living in communities. So I think those are just sort of anchor statements, sort of give you an idea of why HACT are sort of doing work in this area. And I think, kind of thinking about the research and as Gareth's gone through it there, I think HACT do quite a bit of work to sort of evaluate programs and sort of social value and social impact work. And we've done recent work sort of with L&Q around sort of measuring what they do with young people accessing education and employment. But we also run our own programs. So we just launched a program of green skills with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council and Southern Network Group. So, looking at sort of opportunities within the system and where housing associations can add value and where they can access communities in ways that other organisations and services possibly can't. And I think that's sort of a big theme that I think comes out in the research of housing associations are quite uniquely placed in communities, and that anchor institution point is really important within this. But I think it's probably good to touch on, there was a report, I think last week or the week before, from the G15 saying actually, with the current pressures on housing associations, there's roughly about £23 million worth of social value at risk because, of having to concentrate on various new regulations or trying to keep up, quality and service. So I think that kind of lends itself to some sort of questions around, what is the role of our sort of social impact within housing associations right now? HACT do work around community investment. We have our Centre for Excellence in Community Investments that tries to capture and bring together all of this work. And there are significant challenges within that. There is sometimes a perception that this sort of work is a nice to have rather than a critical part of the sector. And we're here to say actually it's very much part of our core purpose as a sector. But there's the acknowledgement of we're in a dynamic situation. Things are changing. When the centre was set up in 2018. It was a different sector. Lots of things hadn't happened by 2018 that have happened now. Communities and the housing sector are in a vastly different place. We have to think about the future of community investment in the social housing sector. Where things have probably been, quite aspirational in the past. Beginning, where we can actually make these interventions to actually where they've become much more sort of based on the critical need within communities. I think about the work we're doing right now with Peabody and the Felix Project around food insecurity in London, about actually there's such an increasing level of need within the food system in social housing communities that, housing associations are almost kind of the last body standing. Then, how can we actually try and work with what's left out there to try and actually structurally look at food insecurity and try and stop that in social housing? And, we've seen some good examples of partnership working in collaboration within that, but that's difficult. I think the point Gareth made around we can't do it alone, I think it's a really strong one. It's something that a lot of organisations should hold on to, but where we see the most social impact is through collaboration and partnerships. At our last London Food Insecurity Network meeting, we talked about a case study between partnership working between Southern Housing, Hyde and the St Giles Trust. And that was all about how do they open this new Islington food bank, and how that led, having those two housing associations join with a charity meant the scale of impact, the number of people that could access the service just opened up massively. But also how they made it a multifaceted service. So it wasn't just about accessing a food bank, it became much more of this is your entry point into these organisations. What more help can we give you along the way? How do we actually, use food insecurity as a way to sort of build better connections across community, but also build skills and knowledge across communities. So those are some really good examples. I think what sort of questions the research is throwing up for me and the work we're doing through HACT is, I guess, thinking about the future. But I guess also the critical role of social housing. So, it does kind of beg the question around, is having a social rent enough? Like right now, is it enough in communities? I think the JRF reports, was it 2023, that around 44% of social renters are in relative low income after housing costs. And the costs have only increased since then, unfortunately. So it does kind of beg the question of what is the role of social housing if we concentrate on our current regulations and consumer standards, the quality and service of homes and communities, great. But if people can't afford to actually stay within that community, what does that mean for the social housing sector? Because we're going to see changes in the local connection test coming up, and not to say quite rightly, in some circumstances, but what does that mean for the allocations system? Is that people coming in more often than not with really significant personal challenges in their life that housing associations are going to have to work with and try and support. But with the increase in challenge comes an increase on resource demand for housing associations. So it does kind of beg the question of if you just stick to the knitting, so to speak, are you just creating a rod for your own back later down the line, where problems are going to build within communities, and you'll start to think about what Gareth was saying about sort of harder to access and harder to support parts of communities. Actually, is that just going to keep getting further and further embedded? And you mentioned the riots. It's a worry, isn't it, of like how desperate people can get and look to sort of anywhere for hope, and where they actually look to for that. So I think that those are some really big questions for the sector to sort of grapple with right now. And I think just to sort of further on that point around being an anchor institution, like I said, we can't do everything as a housing association, but the scale of impact is so wide. Like I've said, what was it, £23 million worth of social value? Like, that's massive. And that's just the G15. That's just a part of London, really. But I think we have to think about, the place as an anchor institution to keep some services going through tough times. I think the evidence we saw through, the last sort of decade of austerity is that, once services leave, they rarely come back. And in order to get them back, it takes even more resource and capacity just to get back to where they were before. So it's trying to see the sort of actual benefit of, like, if we can just see through a few lean years to keep, whether that's to keep your charity partners going or other services going, via funding or just other means to support them, then actually the benefit in the long term is long-term partnerships that actually generate that social impact and social value. I think you can't see past that and the value of that, because that it's that kind of short-term pain for long-term gain. Because I think the evidence we saw through the last sort of decade was that actually we could have really benefited from having more long-term view within communities. Is that actually cutting back on a lot of things set us back a long time in terms of people's skills and knowledge, and it really came to the fore within the sort of the pandemic of the actual impact and trying to get people out of their homes again, for one, but actually into employment and into accessing services. It just increased those barriers massively. And I guess the last sort of reflection I wanted to sort of put out there was, I think that stress on where the government's at right now in terms of stressing on the development of 1.5 million new homes. Ambitious, great to see aspirations with government, and applaud that. But there is that constant danger of focusing too much on developing homes rather than building communities and community infrastructure and community wealth. If we concentrate too much on just the homes itself, there's a school of thought that organically bringing people together and density will, lead to, greater community. But I think the UK, because it's such an old country and such old infrastructures, that it relied on very intricate parts of community, and we're almost sort of we're retrofitting a lot of things into communities, because it just wasn't there when they were built, and we just had to sort of learn and try and test things what worked. But what we have through this aspiration of 1.5 million new homes and new towns is to think from the ground up. What do communities need? What infrastructure do they need? How do we foster connection? And what sort of challenges do we need to make sure there's infrastructure to deal with, so it becomes slightly more self-sustaining, and we don't have to think about interventions and using resource and capacity to do that quite as much in the future within those communities. I mean, I know it'll be a mix of 10 years within that, but I think having an aspiration around that would really be helpful right now. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Lynsey.
Thank you, Dean. Ending on a top line message for Angela Rayner there. We're not short on ambition from our speakers. Thank you very much, Dean. It's really good to hear some wide-ranging thoughts, and you've put some thoughts into my head about the role of local authorities and social housing too. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Chief Executive of Unity Homes and Enterprise, Cedric Boston, who got the idea for this research. So thank you, Cedric, for doing that and bringing us together as a group, and is responsible for the services that have been under the spotlight, and all those voices from the community that we've had through the report. So, Cedric, how have you found the research? How do you see the challenges going forwards, practically and from a policy perspective, for Unity?
Okay, thank you very much, Lynsey. So what I want to do is to briefly just tell you a bit about Unity, tell you a bit about the services that we provide, and then to move on and talk about how this research is going to be helpful in terms of the sector. So about Unity, we started in '87 on the back of the riots that were taking place then, because a lot of BME people felt that they were being disadvantaged and discriminated against, not just on housing, but in all other social and economic aspects as well. And so the philosophy behind the organization was we would provide a decent housing, giving BME people access to decent housing for the first time, and that given decent housing, something that is safe and secure and dry and etc., then that would then be a springboard for them to go on and improve other aspects of their life in terms of their jobs and education of their children, etc. It's important to bear in mind in terms of Unity that our customers are not just our tenants. We are a housing association, but we're also a BME organization, and that means we try to tackle and get involved in racial inequality issues, both locally and also nationally. But we're also an organization with a social purpose to provide economic opportunities for people. So our customers are potentially everybody who lives within the communities in which we serve. Now, our history and culture is really important to us as an organization. The key measure of our success is that the people in the homes that we provide and in the communities that we serve thrive. So although, like many other housing associations, we are a developing organization and keen to develop to meet the housing supply, growth is not the key driver for this organization. The key driver for the organization is the people, rather than being seduced by the idea of growing our business. The focus always tries to remain on the people. And there's in terms of the culture, there's always temptation for culture to shift and move, and we need to constantly be reminding ourselves about where we come from and what we're about. But also, it means that we as an organization are aware that new build isn't always the answer to every question. There might be better ways in which we can make a contribution to improve the lives of people within our community than just simply building new homes. And as an organization, it means that we remain flexible to respond to where the needs is. And that's reason why we now have a social purpose about economic opportunities for people, because around about the 1990s, when it became obvious that the decent home philosophy wasn't this springboard for many people who had suffered disadvantages and discriminations in their life to be able to go off and outdo their predictive life chance, when it became clear that that wasn't happening and people needed other things, other services, other forms of support and assistance, that's when we moved into the idea of providing economic opportunities for people, because we wanted to to focus on something that was going to enable people to make a permanent transition from below the poverty line to sustainably above it, and for themselves and the next generation, and so on. So in terms of what we do, two aspects of our social purpose initiative. First of all, we believe that talent is everywhere, business talent is everywhere, and so we try to encourage local people to get involved in setting up their own businesses if that's what they want to do. And we try and focus on people who otherwise wouldn't get the opportunity to do that. We provide outreach work, training courses. We have a program called Steps to Business that involves finding people within the local community, sending them through 6 months training course to get them to the point where they can create a business plan. And then we would look to help them further that business plan, either to get investment for it, to rent a business space, and to get that business up and running. We have 150 business units that we let initially to fledgling entrepreneurs, and we support those businesses to then expand and transition away from Unity. In terms of impact, and this gets back to what I was saying a minute ago about new build isn't always the best contribution we can make. Our 150 business units supports 100 businesses. They're all based in and around the Chapeltown area, you know, the deprived area as of 1987. And many of the entrepreneurs who set up those businesses come from the community or other parts of Leeds. And those businesses employ 800 people, over 800 people, and 45% of those people come from within the LS7 and LS5 area. So most of them live locally. And I would argue that the impact of Unity Enterprise on the local community is far greater than the developments that we have been able to complete in those areas. And we're an organization that develops something like 20 units a year. We also have an employment team, and that deals with people who I would call them the low-hanging fruit, the people who are already job ready and are just looking for some direction, for help with CVs, applications, and so on, all the way through to people who have various barriers, and then we need to work with them 6 months, 12 months, sometimes even longer, to enable them to overcome those barriers and to become job ready. Every year, this organization helps about 170 people to find employment, and about 250 people into training. So I've covered what we're about and what we do. So the final bit of what I have to say is about the way in which the research, I think, is going to be useful to the sector. Now, the poor economic performance of social tenants is very, very clear. There's lots of information about it. Social housing tenants are the worst, have the worst performance, worst economic performance than any other tenure. The Institute of Employment Studies Research told us that two years ago. And we know that people who live in social housing also have a stigma which makes it more difficult for them to compete effectively within the market. And so they are twice as likely to be unemployed, twice as likely to be economically inactive. So 40% of people in the social housing sector are economically inactive, twice as high as, say, the private rented sector, which arguably is where the worst accommodation is. So we know the need is there. So why is it that housing associations are not en masse sort of reacting and responding to that need? I think if we were to ask many of the housing associations what their priorities were, the economic plight of the people that live in our properties or in the communities that we serve probably wouldn't reach the top 5 of most of them. And you know, why is that? Well, because we give ourselves excuses for not taking on the role that is there for us. The role that, in my view, social housing has always embraced. So one of the things that I think is clear from the research is, yeah, you know, social housing has always had the dual purpose. Yes, on the one hand, to provide the physical needs of people who live in our properties for a home that's safe, warm, and dry, but also social housing also always envisaged that social housing would be the springboard for people to go on and do other things in their life. So it's always been our role. The second thing reason I hear, well, we don't have the expertise, and I think Gareth has really gone into some detail on that about why we do have that expertise, partly because a lot of the barriers that people have to competing effectively within the marketplace are psychological barriers. There's low esteem, feeling that there's a fear of being discriminated against, and which sort of holds people back. And what they need to overcome those psychological barriers aren't the sort of more expensive services that Unity is trying to provide, but what they need is empathy and support and that long-term care that housing associations can, and in many cases do provide. Another reason is, well, agencies are a better place, and again, I think Gareth has addressed this in his speech today and in the study, that there are no agencies, even for whom this is their primary function. There are no agencies that are better placed to reach and engage with the people who are economically isolated than housing associations, not least because those people live in our properties and we have a history of engaging with them and all the housing matters that we engage with them about. The other thing is that, of course, it's going to be high cost, and we got all these other things like decarbonisation and getting to EPCC and the cost of new regulation and so on. But providing that sort of empathy and support is not expensive. It's not going to be expensive to train a housing officer to provide the sort of support that people need to build up their confidence and their resilience, and enable them to overcome those psychological barriers to go out and compete effectively in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, we say to ourselves, well, it doesn't really impact on our business, does it? It doesn't stop us from building another 200 homes next week. Well, I think Glyn addressed this in his presentation, where he said that how long do we think that things can go on like this, and us feel that it doesn't impact our business? Of course, stigmatization and the increasing residualization of social housing will eventually become a bigger problem for us unless we start to address the issues that are facing our tenants at this current time.
Mm.
Thank you,
Cedric. That was really a powerful summing up of your views from Unity and how this research has helped to reinforce and shape some of those. And you've thrown down some really important challenges to the sector on how we all address the employment and life chances of our tenants and residents. So massive thanks, Cedric. And thanks to Dean and Gareth for speaking. I've allowed a little more time. You'll see we're almost at the hour. I can't see, unless I'm missing anything technically, I can't see any open questions, so that's fine. I just wanted to use the last few minutes to cover a couple of thoughts and questions for the panel here, if that's okay. And more is sort of pouring into my head as I reflect on what you said. So I will resist the temptation to just comment on everything you've said and just ask some questions. So first question is to Gareth and perhaps to Cedric, if you can, and it's just in terms of facing the research as it's been presented today and looking at it from the months ago that we started this. I think we started in springtime. Obviously the context has changed and it's not a sort of fixed picture, but did it surprise you? Was there a finding that you weren't expecting or that you looked at afresh and thought, and that has stuck with you from the research so far? Bearing in mind this is primer research, it's not complete and a full picture. But I just wanted to ask Gareth and Cedric, who've been closest to the research, whether on reading it and reflecting on it today, it's told you something or taught you something that you hadn't expected or you know didn't think you'd see. Can I start with Gareth?
Yeah, thank you, Lynsey. I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, there's a few things, but one of the things that has sort of struck me was the sort of the first point around people's stories. And I know this is possibly a sign that I'm not as connected to tenants through the work that I do, and I appreciate that academia is one sort of step back. But I think it's also picking up on some of the points that Cedric made there around these barriers that some people are facing. And one thing that I didn't mention, but I did want to talk about, was that actually a huge barrier that was presented by tenants and people working in the area was actually their own social networks can be preventative of allowing people to have the confidence to go on. So that was cited for many reasons. It could be and it was quoted like this: people like us don't have those opportunities. People like us will never get to that sort of place. And then there was a lot of examples where other family members and people like that can put the barriers on because they don't want you to kind of go out to work. So I think for me, what was really striking was that need for that very back to basics, that actually there's stuff that can be done right now that I feel gets missed a little bit in our sort of long-term strategic thinking. And as both sort of Dean and Cedric have said, that it's important and we need to have that focus, but there's people right now that could be helped by organisations as is happening with Unity. So that kind of really struck me and was a point that I kind of wanted to try and bring to the fore of both the report and today's talk.
Thank you, Gareth. And you have. I really like the back to basics and the person-to-person approach that you are prescribing. I think we badly need them. Cedric, I'm going to ask for your reflections as well. And given the time, I'm going to cheekily ask another very practical question of you, Cedric. And thank you to the Clarion officer who's put this in. So impression, Cedric, but of the report, but also a very practical nuts and bolts GDPR question, our favorite, Cedric. How do you overcome the data protection issue, the ability to market services to tenants and residents which may be challenged as non-core? And the GDPR discussion has been live this week with members in terms of how do you reach people without them saying you're a nuisance caller. So if you don't mind, both a really kind of practical micro and then any final general comments with the last minute, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Cedric.
Yes. So on the GDPR question, cynically, it's about getting legal advice on GDPR on a regular basis. So we were initially handicapped by the advice we got from GDPR on GDPR, which basically told us that we couldn't market these services. And we then set out our stall that we couldn't market the services, and it was a real problem. And then a year ago, we went back for further advice, and the advice changed. And the advice is that actually GDPR is not a problem for us. What is a problem is the data protection legislation, which is a separate piece of legislation. And the advice is essentially that we could market our services to tenants as long as it's in writing in a letter form. We can't market it digitally. So we can't send people an email because there's a bit of legislation that prevents that sort of cold calling on using data. So we've now got legal advice that gives us the all clear to market, provided it's in letter and written form, but we still can't market it digitally. But you know, letter is fine because we do letters and then in person through the through the the tenancy health checks.
Okay, thanks, Cedric. We're
It,
making a note to everyone here today on that. Thank you.
in terms of the first question,
Yeah,
the first question though,
and I'll have
what?
to rush you. Sorry, Cedric, but go ahead.
Well, it's all right. I will.
No, go on. 30 seconds, honestly.
What has really struck me is that there was a lot that we could do without spending huge amounts of money, because of the feedback is sort of making it very clear that what a lot of our customers appreciate is the psychological support that we provide to them. But also turn that around, and you could make connections between this finding in the research and the Better Social Housing Review and the Grenfell inquiry, which is saying that if you treat tenants as if their views are not important, that because they can't help themselves, they're reliant on us, then they don't really matter, then how that undermines their confidence and esteem and make it less likely that they're going to go out into the marketplace and compete effectively. So housing associations are in this position where they can make a really positive difference to people's esteem, confidence, motivation, etc. Just simply in the way that they deal with people,
Yeah.
just about housing services, let alone the other things that can be done.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Cedric. I think those relationships and positive, based on respect, transactions that all social housing has as a sector in its day-to-day business can transform the way we deal with people, and our employment services follow on from that. So I can't better your final words there, Cedric. Thank you very much indeed. To everyone, I'm very sorry we're a couple of minutes over. It's just over 11, but we've heard some great and rich experiences from Gareth, Dean and Cedric today. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions, and we hope you enjoy and can share the report very widely. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone, today. Thank you, Cash. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Lynsey.